What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? The Cadaver Synod. Basically the Pope had a previous Pope's corpse exhumed, so the corpse could stand trial for something made up. So they dug up his bloated 7-month-old corpse and convicted him, retroactively nullifying his papacy. Then they dumped his bloated and convicted corpse in a river. The people got pissed and overthrew the Pope, who was strangled in prison. The next Pope came along and had the corpse collected from the river and its papacy posthumously reinstated. 897 was a crazy year. In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit. Thanks for the award. A lot of Salmonella fans. Huh. The San Francisco Plague of 1904 was a terrible, scary time when the Black Plague was beginning to ravage San Francisco. California's governor tried to suppress information about the outbreak and restrict any activities to curtail it because he feared economic damage to the state. He even tried to get the doctor who was warning people about the outbreak fired. What information did get out was used against the Chinese residents, as it was believed that it was a disease of the unclean. Had it not been for the earthquake in 1906 that devastated the city, the plague outbreak would have probably been more remembered. The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s, they took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden box often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property, or at sea, or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. The story of Hisashi Ouchi and the Takemura incident. He was an employee at the Takemura nuclear plant when there was a disaster which led to him being exposed to nearly twice what is considered deadly in terms of gamma radiation, 17 SV. For reference, at the plant the workers were limited to 50 MSV of exposure yearly. So Ouchi got 340 years worth of safe exposure over the course of a few minutes. The levels have also been compared to what may have been present at the epicenter of the Hiroshima explosion. Ouchi was kept alive, against his will, for 83 days. He was just a shell of flesh and bone and completely lucid for about the first week, enduring pain and suffering most of us could never imagine. He asked doctors to let him die and they didn't. They just prolonged his suffering, and now we know what happens to the body when exposed to extreme levels of radiation. Your organs literally melt, your skin falls off, and it's worse than any horror movie. Oh, and this was in 1999. And the order for nearby residents and businesses to evacuate wasn't sent out for nearly 12 hours. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. The Halifax explosion. regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically there were two types of Rwanda natives, the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs, and after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis, yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never like using that term because of its association with WWII and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killing stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were. The sad case of Otabenga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then WWI happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snake bite. Just a snake bite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The Chinese genocide in Mexico. The Vipahalm experiment. Sweden are mostly known as a not very scary country, with good and mostly accessible dental care. Well, part of how that came to be is this. Hey, you are institutionalized and suffering and powerless. Let's make your teeth rot out of your skull. For us science. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun when they went out at night. They would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. Edit. Apparently there's a new movie about this, as many redditors have helpfully pointed out. The massacre of Kalavryta. It is a village's Greece. The Germans entered it and rounded up all the male villagers in a field. They then shot them all with machine guns. After that they got the children and women and put them in the church. When everyone was inside, they locked the doors and set fire to the church. Around 20 minutes into the burning, a German soldier couldn't take it anymore and opened the doors. Around half of the people escaped the fire, but the rest perished. The German soldier was shot for this, and if you go to Kalavryta today his name is on the memorial. No one was punished for this apart from the leader of the division, who I was told by my grandmother that he died in a gulag. But everyone else got away with it. It is sad that no one knows about this, as things like this happened all over Greece and Russia and Poland. I only know about this because my great-grandmother was one who escaped in the church. This massacre was in retaliation for the villagers supporting the local resistance force, which had recently killed about 10 Nazis. rockingkp, or the chicken poop prison in Thailand, used by French forces to hold political prisoners, rebellious Thai people, in the Chanthaburi region. The long-standing impacts of this much-feared torture are still felt in the region today. There's a Thai saying for those who buck authority that roughly translates to be careful not to get caught in a chicken poop prison. I learned about this prison from my parents, who learned about it from this. How it worked was there was a small 2-story prison. Bottom floor houses the prisoners, and the top floor is basically a huge chicken coop. The grated floor/ceiling ensures that the chicken poop falls onto the prisoners below. Apparently, even though the maximum sentence in rockingkp was around a week, it was one of the most feared punishments there was.